For nearly 1,000 years, the most powerful empires in East Asia ruled the Red River Delta. They sent governors, imposed taxes, introduced Chinese law and writing, and crushed rebellion after rebellion. Yet the people they governed did not simply disappear into China. Instead, they absorbed many of the empire's tools and eventually used them to build an independent state. How did a conquered frontier survive 10 centuries of foreign rule? And why did one river finally end it in 938? That question has a real answer, and it's not the one you'd expect. It isn't a story about cultural purity or unbreakable resistance. It's a story about transformation, about a people who changed deeply under foreign rule and who used that very change as a weapon. And here's what almost nobody talks about. The administrative machinery that Chinese dynasties spent centuries building in the Red River Delta eventually became a foundation that local leaders used to govern themselves. The empire, in trying to absorb the frontier, accidentally taught it how to survive. We're going to follow that process from beginning to end, from the Han conquest in 111 BCE, all the way to a single river battle in 938 that changed everything. And I want to hold one question open for you right now, because we won't answer it until the very end. Why did every rebellion before 938 ultimately fail, while Ngô Quyền did not? The answer isn't military genius alone. It's something that took centuries to build. Keep that in mind as we go. Before we get to conquest, we need to understand what was already there. The Red River Delta is a flat, fertile plain in what is now northern Vietnam, fed by a river system that drains from the highlands of southern China. By the time Han armies arrived, the delta had already been home to a distinct society for centuries. The Lac Viet people had developed their own social structures, their own aristocracy, the Lac Lords, and a material culture known today as Jong Son, famous for its enormous bronze drums. These weren't simple tribal communities. They had wet rice agriculture, trade networks that reached across Southeast Asia, and a hereditary ruling class that organized labor, collected tribute, and commanded local loyalty. The region mattered to outsiders for the same reasons it mattered to locals. Its agricultural surplus, its access to maritime trade routes, and its position as a gateway between the East Asian continent and the sea. To the north, the Kingdom of Nanyue had controlled the delta as a semi-autonomous buffer between the Han Empire and the deeper south. That arrangement ended in 111 BCE, when Han Emperor Wu sent his armies south to conquer Nanyue. Following the Han conquest of Nanyu in 111 BCE, the region encompassing the Red River Delta was reorganized into the Jiaoji Commandery as part of the Han Imperial Administrative Framework. The commandery was headed by a Grand Administrator, a centrally appointed official from the Han Court, responsible for civil administration, tax collection, judicial matters, and maintaining order, through a garrison of Han troops and local levies. On paper, this looked like complete absorption. In practice, it was more complicated. The early Han administrators were practical. They couldn't govern a distant, unfamiliar delta without local cooperation, so they worked through the existing Lac Lords, allowing them to maintain local authority in exchange for loyalty and tribute. It was an arrangement that kept the peace, but it also preserved the very social structures that would later fuel resistance. The Lac Lords kept their land, their networks, and their local prestige. They just answered to a new set of masters in the north. That arrangement started to fray as Han administration became more direct and more demanding. New governors arrived with less patience for local custom. They imposed Chinese legal codes, changed inheritance rules, and introduced taxation systems that cut into the resources of the local aristocracy. Control of this territory gave the Han access to the region's harbours and natural resources while providing an important buffer zone between their empire and the polities to the south. The delta was valuable, and the Han intended to extract that value. For the Lac Lords, this was an existential problem. Their authority was being systematically replaced. The crisis came to a head in 40 CE. The immediate catalyst for the rebellion was the Han governor Su Ding's oppressive measures against Sach. According to historical records, Su Ding's attempts to legally restrain Sach, including threats of beheading without trial, incited Trung Trac to action. Trung Trac was the daughter of a lac lord, and Sach was her husband. When the governor moved against him, she didn't retreat. She organized. Their leadership quickly resonated across the Red River Delta, garnering support from approximately 65 towns and extending to regions like Hepu and Rinan. The sisters effectively united diverse groups under a common cause, leveraging their noble lineage and the widespread discontent to launch a coordinated revolt. As the rebellion gained momentum, Trung Trac was proclaimed Queen Trung, establishing herself as the first female monarch in Vietnamese history. The Han governor Su Ding couldn't contain it. He fled. The Trung sisters had, in the space of months, expelled Chinese authority from the Red River Delta and declared an independent state centered at Mei Lin. Think about what that required. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising. It was a coordinated political act by an existing aristocracy with real governing experience, real networks, and real memory of what autonomy looked like. The lac lords hadn't been absorbed. They'd been waiting. But the Han Empire was not going to accept this quietly. Emperor Guangwu dispatched General Ma Yuan and Duan Ji in 42 CE with a formidable force of 20,000 regular troops and 12,000 regional auxiliaries. Utilizing both land and naval strategies, Ma Yuan systematically dismantled the rebel strongholds, leading to decisive victories. By early 43 CE, the Han forces captured and executed the Trung sisters, either by beheading or through their suicide by leaping into the Hatjiang River, effectively ending the rebellion. The Trung sisters had held power for roughly 3 years, and then it was over. But here's what matters. The rebellion hadn't failed because it was poorly conceived. It failed because the Han Empire was still whole, still powerful, and still capable of projecting overwhelming military force to its southern frontier. The local aristocracy had the will. They didn't yet have the staying power. That distinction is going to matter for the next 900 years. If you enjoy history told through the decisions and hidden forces that shaped nations, subscribe, because Vietnam's first great rebellion was only the beginning. What happened after Ma Yuan's victory was decisive. The Trung sisters' defeat in 43 CE coincided with the end of Zhong Son culture and the Zhong Son metallurgical drum tradition that had flourished in northern Vietnam for centuries, as the Han tightened their grip over the region, culminating in a process that transformed the non-Sinic people. Ma Yuan even melted down the lac bronze drums, which were symbols of local power, and used the bronze to make a statue of a horse for the Chinese emperor. That was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of cultural erasure. Destroy the symbols, and you weaken the memory. The administration that followed was harder and more systematic than anything that had come before. Local Red River Delta elites pledged themselves to Chinese cultural norms and Chinese hierarchy. Chinese techniques, religions, and taxation were forced upon or voluntarily embraced by indigenous tribes. No large-scale uprising occurred in the region for roughly 400 years. 4 centuries of relative quiet. That's not nothing. It suggests that Han control after 43 CE was genuinely effective, not just militarily, but socially. And this is where the story gets complicated in a way that most history lessons skip over. Because what happened during those 4 centuries wasn't simply oppression. It was transformation, and some of that transformation was chosen. Chinese writing spread through the Delta. Confucian ideas about governance, family, and hierarchy took root among local elites who found them useful for organizing their own communities. Buddhism arrived and found a receptive audience. Trade along imperial roads and waterways connected the Delta to a wider economic world. A new kind of local elite emerged. People who were neither purely Chinese nor purely Lac Viet, but who could navigate both worlds. They learned to read imperial documents, to argue in Chinese legal frameworks, to petition governors, to serve in local administration. They became, in other words, capable of governing. This is the central irony of the entire story. The empire was trying to absorb the frontier, but in the process of doing so, it was educating it. And the memory of the Trưng sisters never disappeared. It lived in local oral tradition, in temple worship, in the way communities told stories about who they were and where they came from. Political memory, it turns out, is extraordinarily durable. You can melt the bronze drums. You can't melt what people remember. In 248 CE, a woman known as Lady Trieu led another uprising against Chinese rule. The details of her campaign are fragmentary, and it was suppressed relatively quickly. But her significance isn't military. It's what she represents: the persistence of a political tradition that refused to accept permanent absorption. Each generation that remembered the Trưng sisters was a generation that understood resistance as a legitimate response to foreign rule. Lady Trieu added another name to that tradition, another proof that the idea of autonomy hadn't died with the Han's victory in 43 CE. Now, here's something the story keeps showing us. Every time China fractured, the southern frontier moved. The collapse of the Han in 220 CE, the chaos of the Three Kingdoms period, the fragmentation of the Jin dynasty. Each of these created moments of reduced imperial attention to the south. Local leaders in the Delta had more room to maneuver. Not enough to break free permanently, but enough to consolidate local power, build local networks, and deepen the governing capacity that was quietly accumulating beneath the surface of imperial administration. By the 6th century, that capacity was ready for a real test. China was fragmented again, this time under the Liang dynasty in the south, and a local leader named Li Bi saw his opportunity. In 542 CE, he launched a rebellion that swept through the delta with remarkable speed. By 544, he had expelled the Liang administrators and done something no local leader had done since the Trưng sisters. He declared himself emperor. He named his new state Van Xuan, 10,000 Springs, a name that announced permanence, not just rebellion. He established a court, issued his own political orders, and built the administrative structures of an independent state. Van Xuan was the most ambitious local political project the Delta had yet produced, and it had something the Trưng sisters' state didn't. It survived its founder. Li Bi was eventually pushed back by Liang forces, and he died in the mountains around 548 CE. But his followers continued to resist for decades. Van Xuan persisted as a functioning political entity until 602, when the newly unified Sui dynasty, the same dynasty that was about to build the Grand Canal and exhaust itself in failed campaigns against Korea, sent armies south and reconquered the Delta. But notice what happened between 544 and 602. For nearly 60 years, the Red River Delta had been governed locally. Local administrators had run the tax system, maintained roads, organized labor, and managed the machinery of a state. That experience didn't vanish when the Sui arrived. The people who had done it were still there. Their children were still there. And they remembered. The Tang dynasty, which replaced the Sui in 618, was the most sophisticated imperial administration the region had yet encountered. The region came under the Protectorate General to pacify the south in 679, a formal administrative structure designed to manage the southern frontier with greater institutional depth than previous arrangements. The Tang built roads, expanded the regional capital at what is now Hanoi, developed trade networks, and deepened the integration of local elites into imperial bureaucracy. Local men who could pass Chinese examinations, who could read and write in classical Chinese, who understood Tang legal codes, these men had real careers available to them within the imperial system. And many of them took those careers. Here's the hidden cost of that arrangement. The Tang was, in a very real sense, training its own eventual replacements. Every local official who learned to collect taxes, manage a garrison, adjudicate disputes, and organize public works was accumulating exactly the skills needed to govern independently. The empire's administrative integration was producing a class of people who understood power from the inside. In 687, a local uprising against particularly harsh taxation was suppressed. Then in 722, a much larger rebellion broke out under a leader known as Mai Thuk Loan, who mobilized significant regional support and held out for a period before Tang forces eventually crushed the movement. The pattern was becoming familiar. Local grievance, regional mobilization, initial success, eventual defeat. Each cycle left behind a political memory and a more experienced local leadership class. Then came Feng Hung. In the late 8th century, as Tang authority was stretched by internal rebellions, most devastatingly the An Lushan rebellion, which had nearly broken the dynasty in the 750s, Feng Hung seized the regional capital and governed the delta for a period before Tang control was nominally restored after his death. What's striking about Feng Hung isn't just that he succeeded temporarily, it's that he governed. He didn't just raid and retreat, he administered. He collected taxes, managed local affairs, and ran the machinery of the region using the same institutional forms the Tang had installed. The conquest was becoming, slowly and almost invisibly, a school. By the end of the 8th century, Tang control over the delta was increasingly theoretical. The dynasty was dealing with warlords in the north, succession crises at court, and the slow unraveling of the central authority that had made it great. On the southern frontier, the question was no longer whether local leaders could govern, they clearly could, but whether the Tang was still strong enough to stop them from doing so permanently. The answer came in 905. The Tang dynasty was in its final years of collapse, the empire fracturing into what historians call the Five Dynasties period, a chaotic sequence of short-lived northern regimes, none of which had the reach or the resources of the old Tang. Kuch Thuadu, a prominent landowner from Haiduong, capitalized on the ensuing anarchy by assuming the position of military governor in Tong Bin, modern Hanoi, around 905, effectively sidelining Tang-appointed officials through a combination of local support and minimal resistance. This is the moment the whole story has been building toward, but it didn't look dramatic from the outside. Kuch Thuadu didn't declare independence. He didn't proclaim himself emperor. He used the Tang's own administrative title, military governor, and simply applied it to himself. He kept the forms of imperial administration intact while draining them of imperial content. This demonstrated a skillful maneuver to make use of the apparatus and the name of the invaders to seize power and autonomy as a first step toward complete independence. And here's what made it work where every previous rebellion had failed. There was no Tang dynasty left to send Ma Yuan. The empire that had crushed the Trưng sisters, that had reconquered Van Xuan, that had suppressed Mai Thuk Loan and restored control after Feng Hung, that empire no longer existed as a coherent military power. His administration prioritized reducing corvée labor and tax burdens on peasants, fostering loyalty among the populace, and laying the groundwork for indigenous governance independent of imperial oversight. Kuch Thuadu's son, Kuch Hao, succeeded him in 907 and further consolidated this autonomy by implementing administrative reforms, including land redistribution to bolster agricultural productivity and local military recruitment. The Kuch family governed the Delta for over 2 decades. They were not rebels, they were administrators. They ran the region using the institutional knowledge that centuries of imperial rule had deposited in local hands. The conquered frontier had learned to govern itself. But the fragmentation of China had also produced new regional powers, and one of them had ambitions in the south. In 930, the southern Han rulers in China launched a full-scale invasion of Vietnam, overthrew the Kuch family, and sent their own officials to directly rule the region. The third Kuch ruler was captured and taken north. It looked, for a moment, like the old pattern was reasserting itself. It wasn't. In 931, Duong Jin Ninghe led a force of 3,000 hand-trained warriors from Thanh Hoa to Gia La, modern Hanoi, where he defeated the occupying Southern Han garrison, killing their commander and driving out the remaining Chinese troops. Duong Jin Nge was a general who had served under the Cooch family. He understood the administrative machinery the Cooch had built. He stepped into their role and governed the Delta as military governor, maintaining de facto independence while the Southern Han seethed from a distance. For 6 years, the arrangement held. And then, in 937, it fell apart from the inside. In 937, Kieu Kong Tien assassinated Duong Jin Nge to seize his position, provoking a revolt led by Ngô Quyền, who sought revenge for his lord and father-in-law. Kieu Kong Tien had done something catastrophically short-sighted. He had killed the man holding the Delta together, and then, facing the immediate threat of Ngô Quien's retribution, he appealed to Liu Yan, the emperor of Southern Han, for reinforcements. He had invited the empire back in. In 937, Liu Yan, the Southern Han ruler, took the chance to intervene in Vietnam again after the death of Duong Jin Nge. He had been foiled in 931, but now that Duong Jin Nge was dead, he thought the time was ripe for another attempt. He placed his own son, Liu Hongzhao, in command of the expedition, naming him Peaceful Sea Military Governor and King of Jiao. Ngô Quyền moved fast. He dealt with Kieu Kong Tien first. The traitor was defeated and executed before the Southern Han fleet even arrived. Then Ngô Quyền turned his full attention to the river. Liu Hongzhao's plan was to ascend the Bạch Đằng River and place his army in the heart of the region before disembarking. The Bạch Đằng was the major riverine route into the Red River Plain from the north. This location featured strong tidal currents and shallow channels that favored ambush tactics over open naval confrontation, leveraging local geographic knowledge against the invaders' larger warships. Ngô Quyền knew this river. He knew its tides, and he used that knowledge to set a trap that the Southern Han fleet never saw coming. He had his men plant a barrier of large poles in the bed of the river. The tops of the poles reached just below the water level at high tide and were sharpened and tipped with iron. The trap was invisible at high water. It was lethal when the tide fell. When Liu Hongzhao appeared off the mouth of the river, Ngô Quyền sent out small, shallow draft boats at high tide to provoke a fight and then retreat upriver, drawing the Chinese fleet in pursuit. The Southern Han commander took the bait. His heavy warships followed the retreating Vietnamese boats into the river, pressing forward, confident in their numbers and their firepower. Then the tide turned. As the tide fell, the heavy Chinese warboats were caught on the poles and lay trapped in the middle of the river, whereupon they were attacked by Ngô Quien's forces. More than half the Chinese were drowned, including Liu Hongzhao. When news of the battle reached the survivors, Liu Yan wept openly. He collected what remained of his army and returned to Canton. The Southern Han invasion was over. The fleet that was supposed to restore imperial control had been destroyed in a single afternoon by a man who understood the river better than any governor sent from the north ever could. This triumph enabled Ngô Quyền to proclaim himself king in 939, founding the Ngo dynasty. He set his capital at Ko Loa, an ancient site that carried its own historical memory, and began building the institutions of a genuinely independent state. Now we can answer the question we opened with. Why did this battle succeed where every previous rebellion had failed? It wasn't just the stakes in the river. It wasn't just Ngô Quien's tactical brilliance, though that was real. The answer is structural, and it goes back centuries. Every earlier rebellion, the Trung sisters, Li Bi, Mai Thuk Loan, Phung Hung, had faced the same fundamental problem. They could expel imperial administrators, but they couldn't prevent the empire from sending more. The Han was whole. The Sui was whole. The early Tang was whole. A whole empire with its enormous military resources and its ability to project force across long distances, could always eventually reconquer a frontier that lacked the depth to sustain permanent independence. By 938, that calculus had changed completely. The Tang was gone. The north was fragmented into competing states, none of which had the resources or the stability to mount a sustained reconquest of the south. The southern Han was a regional power, not a continental empire. When Ngô Quyền destroyed its fleet, there was no second army waiting behind it. The northern empire had, for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, genuinely lost its reach. But here's the other half of the answer, and it's the one that the military history alone doesn't capture. When Ngô Quyền won at Bạch Đằng, there was already a functioning local government in place. The Khúc family had built it. Dương Đình Nghệ had maintained it. The administrative knowledge that centuries of imperial rule had transferred to local elites. The ability to collect taxes, manage officials, organize labor, maintain roads, adjudicate disputes. All of that was already there. Ngô Quyền didn't have to invent a state from scratch after his victory. He stepped into one that was already running. That is what made 938 different from 40 CE. The Trưng sisters won a military victory and then had to build a government while fighting a war. Ngô Quyền won a military victory and then formalized a government that already existed. The empire had spent 1,000 years trying to absorb the frontier, and in doing so, it had inadvertently equipped the frontier to govern itself. The Red River Delta survived not because it remained unchanged. It survived because it changed in exactly the right ways. It absorbed Chinese writing, Chinese administrative forms, Chinese legal ideas, and Chinese governing techniques, and then used all of them to build something the empire never intended, a state that could stand without imperial support. It preserved, across generations of defeat and suppression, the political memory that said this land had been governed locally before, and could be again. And it waited, through 4 centuries of post-Trưng quiet, through the brief flame of Van Xuan, through the Khúc family's careful maneuvering, for the moment when the empire that had conquered it was too fractured to reconquer it again. That moment came in 938, on a river where the tide goes out twice a day, and where Ngô Quyền had planted his stakes in exactly the right place. Vietnam did not survive 1,000 years of rule by remaining unchanged. It survived by learning what to absorb, remembering what not to surrender, and recognizing the moment when a frontier could finally become a state.